He left his car in the parking lot. When he returned, a note was attached to the cat. The autumn leaves swirled across the empty parking lot of Willow Glen's only supermarket as Merrick Dolan pulled his aging Buick into his usual spot. The car, much like its owner, was well maintained but showed unmistakable signs of age, small rust spots around the wheel wells, a slight hesitation when shifting gears, and a peculiar rattle that only appeared on cold mornings. "Just a quick trip today, Pindle," Merrick said, glancing at the ginger cat curled up on the passenger seat. "Mrs. Abernathy's raspberry scones will be gone if we don't get there early." The cat blinked slowly in response, his amber eyes fixed on Merrick with that peculiar intensity that always made the man feel seen in ways he couldn't quite explain. Pindle wasn't like other cats Merrick had known through his 67 years. There was something deliberate about him, something watchful, and knowing that transcended ordinary animal awareness. Merrick adjusted his wool cap against the October chill and stepped out of the car, leaving the window cracked just enough for fresh air. Pindle settled more deeply into the seat, his tail curled neatly around his paws, as if to say he'd be waiting right there. 3 years had passed since Eleanor had died. 3 years of learning to cook for one, of speaking thoughts aloud to empty rooms, of reaching across the bed at night only to find cold sheets. Merrick had adapted as best he could, settling into routines that provided structure if not joy. Monday was for groceries and errands, Tuesday for volunteering at the local library, Wednesday for his weekly hike along Cedar Creek. The days had a predictable rhythm that kept him moving forward, even when the weight of solitude threatened to root him in place. Until Pindle. Merrick still remembered that rainy afternoon at the library 6 months ago. He'd been helping Mrs. Calloway catalogue a donation of vintage hardcovers in the dusty storage room when he first heard the quiet mewing. The sound had led him to a cardboard box behind a stack of encyclopedias, where a thin, bedraggled cat stared up at him with unblinking eyes. "Well, hello there," Merrick had said, kneeling despite the protest of his arthritic knee. "You're a long way from anywhere, aren't you?" Mrs. Calloway had bustled over, her silver-rimmed glasses perched on the end of her nose. "Oh my, where did this poor thing come from? We don't have mice, I assure you, Mr. Dolan." The cat had no collar, no tags, nothing to indicate where he'd come from or to whom he belonged. His reddish-orange fur was matted in places, and his frame was thin, though not emaciated. When Merrick carefully extended his hand, the cat had sniffed it once, then butted his head against Merrick's palm with surprising force. "I'll take him to the shelter," Merrick had offered, though the words felt hollow as soon as they left his mouth. "That's very kind of you, Mrs. Calloway had replied, relief evident in her voice. "I would, but my Percival, he's terribly allergic." By the time Merrick had carried the cat to his car, wrapped in an old sweater from his trunk, something had shifted. The cat had settled into his arms with an ease that suggested recognition, as if they'd known each other in some previous life, and when Merrick had placed him on the passenger seat, the cat had simply sat there, looking at him expectantly. The shelter had been closed. Or at least that's what Merrick told himself when he drove home instead, stopping at the grocery store to buy cat food, a litter box, and a few toys that the cashier recommended. "Just temporary," he'd muttered to himself as he set up a corner of the kitchen for his new guest. "Just until we find where you belong." But by morning, as Merrick watched the cat stretch luxuriously in a patch of sunlight streaming through the kitchen window, he knew this wasn't temporary. Somehow, in the space of a few hours, it felt as if the cat had always been there. A missing piece of his life that he hadn't recognized was absent until it was filled. He named him Pindle, after a character in one of Eleanor's favorite novels, a quiet, observant witness to grand events who ultimately played a pivotal role in the story's resolution. It seemed fitting, somehow. Now, as Merrick pushed his cart through the familiar aisles of Wilson's Market, he found himself picking up Pindle's favorite treats, along with his own groceries. It was curious how quickly the cat had transformed from an unexpected visitor to an essential part of his daily considerations. He added a can of the premium tuna that Pindle favored to his basket, smiling faintly at his own indulgence. "Spoiling that cat of yours again, are you, Merrick?" Rose Wilson called from behind the butcher counter. Her family had owned the market for 3 generations, and at 72 she still worked most days, her hands gnarled with arthritis, but her memory sharp as ever. "He's particular about his tastes," Merrick replied, approaching the counter. "Just like someone else I know." He gave her a pointed look that made Rose laugh. "I suppose I deserve that," she conceded, wiping her hands on her apron. "How is the little fellow, still following you around like a shadow?" "More or less. He's waiting in the car now, probably watching the birds. Always watching something, that one." Rose nodded, her eyes softening. "Animals know things, Merrick. My Harold always said that God gave them extra senses to make up for not having our words." She wrapped his usual order, 2 lamb chops, in butcher paper with practiced movements. "You seem better these days. It's good to see." Merrick accepted the package with a nod. "Small steps, I suppose." "Small steps are still steps." Rose patted his hand. "Eleanor would be pleased." The mention of his late wife sent the familiar pang through his chest, but it was duller now, tempered by time and perhaps by the quiet companionship that had entered his life. He finished his shopping, added a loaf of sourdough bread that he didn't really need but that Eleanor had always loved, and made his way to the checkout. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the scent of wood smoke and impending rain. Merrick quickened his pace, groceries balanced in his arms. From a distance he could see Pindle still perched on the passenger seat, his attention fixed on something outside the car. As Merrick approached, however, he noticed something unusual. Pindle had moved to the driver's side window, his paws on the dashboard as he peered out intently. And there, beside the car, stood a woman Merrick didn't recognize. She was perhaps in her 50s, with salt and pepper hair pulled back in a practical bun. Her blue uniform, some kind of medical scrubs, was partially covered by a beige cardigan. She seemed to be looking at Pindle with an expression of profound surprise. When she noticed Merrick approaching, she stepped back quickly, almost guiltily. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I wasn't going to disturb him. I thought I recognized—" She didn't finish her sentence. Instead, she offered a hasty smile and turned away, walking briskly toward a white sedan parked several spaces over. "Wait," Merrick called, but she was already opening her car door. "It's a beautiful cat," she called back. "Take good care of him." Before Merrick could respond, she had slipped into her car and pulled away, leaving him standing in the parking lot with his groceries and a strange sense of unease. What had she recognized? And why had she seemed so affected by the sight of Pindle? As he unlocked his car and settled the groceries on the back seat, Pindle turned to him with those unblinking amber eyes. For the first time, Merrick wondered about the cat's life before their paths had crossed. Who had he belonged to? Where had he come from? And why did he feel increasingly that there was something significant about this animal that he was missing? He reached out to stroke Pindle's head, feeling the familiar rumble of a purr beneath his fingertips. "You're quite the mystery, aren't you?" he murmured. Pindle blinked slowly, then turned his gaze back to the road where the woman's car had disappeared. In the distance, thunder rolled across the mountains, promising a storm before nightfall. Something told Merrick that the encounter in the parking lot was not merely a coincidence. Something told him that the mystery of Pindle was only beginning to unfold. The following Monday dawned grey and somber, the kind of day that seemed to trap the small town of Willow Glen under a blanket of melancholy. Merrick woke to the sound of rain pattering against his bedroom window, and the warm weight of Pindle curled against his side. The cat had his own plush bed beside the dresser, but invariably Merrick would wake to find him settled on the empty half of the mattress, Eleanor's half, as if keeping watch over the space she'd once occupied. "Going to be a wet one today," Merrick murmured, scratching behind Pindle's ears. The cat stretched, his claws extending momentarily, before he settled back into a comfortable loaf shape. Still, errands won't run themselves. Breakfast was a simple affair: toast with raspberry jam, scrambled eggs, and strong black coffee. Merrick ate at the kitchen table, a worn paperback propped against the sugar bowl, while Pindle delicately consumed his own breakfast from a ceramic dish painted with fish. Eleanor had bought the dish years ago, amused by its whimsy, though they'd never owned a cat until now. Merrick wondered sometimes what she would have thought of Pindle. Her gentle heart had always had a soft spot for strays and broken things. By mid-morning, the rain had settled into a steady drizzle. Merrick decided to make his weekly trip to the community center, where a small farmers' market operated year-round in the parking lot. Even in poor weather, local vendors gathered under canopies and tents, offering everything from fresh produce to homemade jams and handcrafted items. "Coming along?" he asked Pindle, who had been watching him gather his reusable shopping bags. The cat's answer was to trot to the front door and wait expectantly. Merrick smiled, despite the gloomy weather. It was one of Pindle's endearing traits, his evident enthusiasm for their outings. Unlike most cats who preferred the safety and comfort of home, Pindle seemed to relish adventures. He rode in the car with dignity, watching the passing scenery with the air of a seasoned traveler. They arrived at the community center, just as the church bells chimed 11. The parking lot was less crowded than usual, the weather having deterred all but the most dedicated shoppers. Merrick found a spot close to the entrance and turned to Pindle. "I won't be long, just the usual, you'll wait here." Pindle settled more comfortably into the passenger seat, his message clear. He would be right there when Merrick returned. Navigating between puddles, Merrick made his way to Mrs. Oakhurst's bakery stall, where he selected a loaf of honey wheat bread and 2 apple turnovers. At Farmer Jensen's table, he chose a basket of late-season tomatoes and a bundle of carrots, still flecked with rich black soil. The ritual of these selections, the small talk with vendors he'd known for years, the careful consideration of which fruits looked ripest, was comforting in its predictability. He was examining a display of local honey when he felt a tap on his shoulder. Turning, he found himself face to face with George Harmon, Willow Glen's only postal worker. "Thought that was you, Merrick," George said, his ruddy face creased in a smile beneath the hood of his raincoat. "Getting your weekly supplies, I see." "Can't let a little rain interfere with routine," Merrick replied, selecting a jar of wildflower honey. "How's Marion doing with her hip?" George's expression sobered slightly. "Good days and bad. More good than bad lately, thank the Lord. She's still set on making it to the fall festival next month." "She will," Merrick said with more confidence than he felt. Marion Harmon had been battling cancer for the past year, her once robust frame now diminished by treatments and pain. "She's the strongest woman in town." "That she is." George nodded, then seemed to remember something. "Say, I noticed you've got yourself a cat these days." "Orange fellow?" Merrick blinked in surprise. "Yes, Pindle. Had him about 6 months now." "How did you know?" "Saw him in your car window last week when I was delivering a package to Mrs. Fisher next door. Distinctive-looking cat. Calm, too. Most cats would be clawing to get out, but he just sat there watching me like he was taking mental notes." George chuckled. "Reminded me of old Mr. Finch, the way he used to stare over his glasses during town meetings." Merrick smiled at the comparison. Albert Finch had been Willow Glen's mayor for 30 years, known for his penetrating gaze and uncanny ability to see through pretense. He does have a way of looking at you that makes you wonder what he's thinking. "Well, he's a fine-looking animal. Marion always wanted a cat, but with my allergies." George shrugged. "Anyway, I should get going. Got a route to finish, rain or shine. Give my best to that watchful companion of yours." Merrick finished his shopping, adding a small bundle of late-blooming asters to his basket on impulse. Eleanor had loved fresh flowers, keeping vases throughout the house even in winter. He'd abandoned the practice after her death, but lately he'd found himself returning to small habits that honored her memory rather than dwelling on her absence. 20 minutes after leaving Pindle, Merrick returned to the car, his arms laden with purchases. As he approached, he could see the cat still sitting in the passenger seat, but something was different. Pindle was alert, his posture tense, eyes fixed on something outside Merrick's line of sight. Setting his bags down on the wet pavement, Merrick fumbled for his keys. As he opened the driver's side door, he noticed that Pindle had not moved to greet him as usual. Instead, the cat remained focused on something beyond the windshield. "What is it, old fellow?" Merrick asked, sliding into his seat. He followed Pindle's gaze but saw only the nearly empty parking lot, raindrops dancing on puddles, and the blurred outlines of the market tents in the distance. It was only when he turned back to Pindle that he noticed it, a small piece of paper, carefully tucked into the cat's collar. Merrick's heart skipped a beat. He was certain the paper hadn't been there when he'd left the car. With fingers that suddenly felt clumsy, he gently extracted the note. It was folded into a neat square, slightly damp at the edges from the rain. The paper was good quality, thick and cream-colored, the kind used for formal correspondence. Merrick unfolded it carefully, aware of Pindle's eyes on him, as if the cat was watching for his reaction. The handwriting was elegant and slanted, written in blue ink that had blurred slightly in the dampness. The first line made his breath catch. "You don't know who he is, but I do. Please read to the end." Merrick looked up sharply, scanning the parking lot through rain-streaked windows. Who had been at his car? Who knew about Pindle? But the lot remained empty, save for a few distant figures hurrying between market stalls. With a growing sense of unease, he returned to the note. "I recognized your cat immediately. I work at Emmanuel Care Home, and several months ago, during a terrible storm, this same cat appeared at our facility. He entered through the back door and walked directly, without hesitation, to room 12B. In that room was Imelda Rennick, a terminal patient with few visitors and constant pain. The room always smelled of lavender and old time, with windows slightly ajar and the continuous sound of monitors filling the silence. The moment the cat lay on her chest, something changed. Her pain ceased. Her anxiety diminished. And for the first time in weeks she smiled. The doctors allowed him to stay. For 9 days the cat never left the room. He slept beside her, touched his nose to her hand when her heartbeat became irregular, and purred softly whenever she had difficulty breathing. On the 10th day, Imelda passed away, and the cat disappeared. No one knew how he got out. When I saw him in your car, I had no doubt it was him. Thank you for continuing what Imelda began, caring for him." The note was signed simply with the initials LH. In the bottom corner was a small, hand-drawn 4-leaf clover. Merrick sat in stunned silence, the note trembling slightly in his hands. Rain drummed on the car roof, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled. But all he could focus on was the cat beside him, watching him with those intelligent amber eyes that suddenly seemed to hold depths he'd never fully appreciated. "Pindle," he whispered, reaching out to stroke the cat's head. "Who are you, really?" The cat blinked slowly, then leaned into Merrick's touch, a low purr rumbling in his chest. It was such a normal, everyday gesture, and yet now it seemed imbued with new meaning. This wasn't just a stray cat that had wandered into his life by chance. This was a being with a history, with purpose, with what appeared to be an extraordinary capacity for compassion. Merrick reread the note, trying to absorb its implications. Emmanuel Care Home. He knew of it. A palliative care facility on the outskirts of town. Imelda Rennick, the name was unfamiliar. And LH, who could that be? The woman he'd seen in the parking lot the previous week. It seemed likely, given the timing. His mind raced with questions. How had the cat known to go to that specific room? How had he known the woman needed comfort? And how had he found his way to Merrick after she died? Was it mere coincidence, or something more? Merrick folded the note carefully and slipped it into his wallet. He started the car, the familiar rumble of the engine a stark contrast to the unfamiliar thoughts swirling in his mind. "Let's go home," he said to Pindle, who had settled back into the passenger seat, seemingly content now that the note had been delivered and read. "I think we have a lot to figure out." As they drove through the rain-slicked streets of Willow Glen, Merrick couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just taken an unexpected turn. The quiet existence he'd carefully constructed after Eleanor's death, predictable, safe, insulated from surprise, had been disrupted by a simple piece of paper and the revelation that his companion was far more extraordinary than he'd realized. And somewhere beneath his confusion and wonder was a small growing spark of something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Curiosity. A desire to know more, to understand, to follow this mysterious thread and see where it led. By the time they reached home, the rain had stopped, and weak sunlight was breaking through the clouds. As Merrick unloaded his groceries, he noticed Pindle sitting by the front door, waiting with unusual impatience to be let inside. All right, Merrick said, fumbling with his keys. "I'm coming." But as he opened the door, Pindle darted past him and disappeared into the house with uncharacteristic urgency. Puzzled, Merrick followed, grocery bags in hand. He found the cat in the study, standing on Eleanor's old desk, pawing at the bottom drawer, the one where Merrick kept old photographs and mementos. It was as if Pindle was trying to tell him something, urging him towards some discovery. "What is it?" Merrick asked, setting down his bags and approaching the desk. "What are you trying to show me?" Pindle looked at him with those knowing eyes, then pawed at the drawer again. The message seemed clear. Open it. With a strange feeling of anticipation, Merrick pulled open the drawer. Inside were albums and loose photographs, cards and letters, the physical artifacts of a life shared with Eleanor. On top was a faded photograph he hadn't looked at in years. Eleanor standing in front of Emmanuel Care Home, her arm around an elderly woman with white hair and a frail smile. Merrick picked up the photo, his hands trembling slightly. He turned it over. On the back, in Eleanor's neat handwriting, were the words, "Visiting Aunt Immy, Spring 2018. Immy, Imelda." Merrick sank into the desk chair, the photograph clutched in his hand, as the implications washed over him. Eleanor's aunt, a distant relation he'd met only a few times over the course of their marriage. The elderly woman had lived in another state for most of her life, only moving to a care facility near Willow Glen in her final years. Had Pindle somehow known of this connection? Had he been drawn to Imelda because of her relation to Eleanor, and then to Merrick because of his? Or was it all merely coincidence, strange and remarkable, but ultimately random? Merrick looked at Pindle, who had settled on the desk beside him, his tail curled neatly around his paws. The cat returned his gaze steadily, as if waiting for Merrick to understand something important. "There's more to this story, isn't there?" Merrick said softly. "And somehow you want me to find it." Pindle blinked slowly, and in that simple gesture, Merrick felt an unmistakable affirmation. Outside, the last rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the study floor. Within those shadows, Merrick could almost see the shape of a new journey beginning, one that would lead him far from the safe, predictable life he'd constructed, into territories of memory and meaning he'd long ago sealed away. Wednesday morning greeted Willow Glen with a pristine sky, the rain having washed away the lingering haze of autumn and left behind a crystalline clarity. Merrick sat at his kitchen table, the mysterious note spread before him, along with the photograph of Eleanor and her aunt. Pindle sat opposite him, paws tucked beneath his chest, watching with that steady gaze that now seemed laden with unspoken knowledge. The cat had been unusually attentive since the discovery of the note, following Merrick from room to room, his presence both comforting and vaguely unsettling. "I should just let it go," Merrick said aloud, more to himself than to Pindle. "A strange coincidence, that's all. Why complicate things?" But even as he spoke, he knew he couldn't, simply file away the note and continue as before. Something had shifted in his carefully ordered world, like a book pulled slightly out of alignment on a shelf, disrupting the neat pattern of his days. He traced the initials at the bottom of the note. L.H. The woman in scrubs from the parking lot. It seemed the most likely explanation. Someone who worked at Emmanuel Care Home, who had recognized Pindle and felt compelled to share his story. "I suppose there's only one way to find out," Merrick said, folding the note and tucking it into his shirt pocket. "What do you say, Pindle? Up for a little detective work?" The cat stretched languidly, then jumped down from the chair and padded to the front door, looking back expectantly. "I'll take that as a yes." Emmanuel Care Home sat on the outskirts of Willow Glen, a low, sprawling building of warm brick and large windows. Originally built in the 1970s as a regular nursing home, it had been renovated and repurposed 15 years ago to specialize in end-of-life care. A circular driveway led to the main entrance, bordered by carefully tended flower beds, where late-blooming asters and chrysanthemums provided splashes of color against the autumn landscape. Merrick parked in the visitor's lot, his stomach knotted with an unexpected nervousness. He hadn't been here since Eleanor's aunt had passed away 4 years ago. A brief, awkward visit, where he'd felt like an intruder in the quiet, dimly lit hallways where people came to spend their final days. "Wait here," he told Pindle, who had moved to the edge of the passenger seat, clearly interested in their destination. "I won't be long." Inside, the facility was warmer and brighter than Merrick remembered. The reception area featured comfortable seating, watercolor landscapes on the walls, and a small water feature that created a gentle, soothing background sound. A young woman with a kind face sat behind the reception desk, looking up as Merrick approached. "Good morning," she said, her smile professional but genuine. "Welcome to Emmanuel Care Home. How can I help you today?" Merrick hesitated, suddenly realizing he hadn't fully thought through his approach. "I'm looking for someone who works here," he said finally. "I only have initials, LH. It's about, well, it's a personal matter." The receptionist's smile dimmed slightly. "I'm sorry, sir, but I can't provide staff information without proper authorization. Perhaps if you could tell me more about the nature of your inquiry." Merrick shifted uncomfortably. How could he explain about a mysterious note attached to his cat without sounding slightly unhinged? "It's regarding a patient who was here some months ago," he said carefully. "Imelda Rennick. She was a relative of my late wife." At the mention of Imelda's name, something flickered across the receptionist's face. Recognition, certainly, but also something else. Surprise? Concern? "One moment, please," she said, reaching for the phone. She spoke quietly into the receiver, her eyes occasionally darting to Merrick. After a brief conversation, she replaced the handset and offered him a measured smile. "Dr. Abrams will be able to speak with you. If you'd like to have a seat, he'll be out shortly." Merrick thanked her and settled into one of the plush chairs, leafing absently through a magazine while his mind raced. Who was Dr. Abrams? What would he say about Imelda, or about a mysterious orange cat that had apparently provided comfort during her final days? He didn't have long to wonder. Within minutes, a tall man with salt-and-pepper hair and wire-rimmed glasses appeared in the reception area. He wore a white coat over casual clothes and carried himself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to navigating difficult situations. "Mr. Dolan?" he asked, approaching Merrick with an extended hand. "I'm Dr. Stephen Abrams, medical director here at Emmanuel. Would you mind joining me in my office? We can speak more comfortably there." Merrick followed Dr. Abrams down a sunlit corridor, past rooms where elderly residents sat reading or gazing out windows, attended by staff in blue scrubs similar to those the woman in the parking lot had worn. The hallway smelled of lemon polish and fresh flowers, a deliberate effort, Merrick suspected, to mask the more clinical scents that inevitably permeated such places. Dr. Abrams' office was small but pleasant, with bookshelves lining one wall and family photos arranged neatly on his desk. He gestured for Merrick to take a seat in a comfortable chair facing the desk. "So," Dr. Abrams said, settling into his own chair, "you're interested in Imelda Rennick. May I ask your connection to her?" "She was my wife's aunt," Merrick explained, "though I met her only a few times. My wife Eleanor used to visit her here occasionally before—" He trailed off, the familiar constriction in his throat whenever he spoke of Eleanor's death, making it difficult to continue. Dr. Abrams nodded sympathetically. "I remember Eleanor. She was one of the few visitors Mrs. Rennick received regularly. I was sorry to hear of her passing." Merrick nodded, then took a deep breath. "The reason I'm here is actually a bit unusual. I have a cat, an orange tabby named Pindle. Yesterday, I found a note attached to his collar while I was out shopping. The note was from someone with the initials LH who works here." He removed the note from his pocket and handed it to Dr. Abrams, who read it with a carefully neutral expression. When he looked up, however, there was unmistakable recognition in his eyes. "Yes," Dr. Abrams said quietly. "I remember this cat. Quite remarkable. He appeared during that terrible thunderstorm in April. Must have slipped in when someone opened the back door. Normally we would have removed him immediately. Health regulations, you understand. But by the time anyone realized he was here, he had already found his way to Mrs. Rennick's room." "Doctor." Abrams leaned back in his chair, his expression softening at the memory. "Mrs. Rennick was in considerable pain at that point. The cancer had spread extensively, and even with our best efforts, we were struggling to keep her comfortable. But when that cat jumped onto her bed and settled against her, the change was, well, remarkable doesn't quite cover it." "The note mentioned he stayed for 9 days, Merrick prompted. "Yes, we made an exception to our usual policies. In end-of-life care, comfort becomes the primary concern, and it was clear that this animal was providing something we couldn't." Dr. Abrams smiled faintly. "Some of the staff started calling him Dr. Cat. He seemed to know when Mrs. Rennick was in distress, even before the monitors alerted us. He would purr against her chest when her breathing became labored, and it would ease. He would nuzzle her hand when she became agitated, and she would calm. And then she died," Merrick said softly. Dr. Abrams nodded. "Peacefully, which isn't always the case. The cat was with her, and afterward, yes, he disappeared. We assumed he'd slipped out the same way he'd come in." Merrick sat in silence for a moment, absorbing this confirmation of the note's story. It wasn't just a strange tale or a case of mistaken identity. Pindle had indeed been there, had indeed formed this connection with Eleanor's aunt in her final days. "Do you know who LH might be?" he asked finally. "The person who wrote the note?" A shadow passed over Dr. Abrams's face. I believe that would be Lisa Hargrove, one of our night nurses. She was particularly attached to Mrs. Rennick and spent a lot of time with her. She was also the one who advocated most strongly for allowing the cat to stay. Was? Merrick noted the past tense with a flicker of concern. Dr. Abrams sighed. Lisa no longer works here. She left about 2 months ago. Health reasons. He hesitated, then added, I'm not at liberty to discuss personnel matters, Mr. Dolan, but I can tell you that Lisa is a compassionate caregiver who formed deep connections with her patients. Do you know how I might contact her? I'd like to talk to her about the note. I'm afraid I can't provide that information, Dr. Abrams said, his tone regretful but firm. Privacy policies. But, he paused, seeming to consider something. If you'd like to leave your contact information, I could pass it along to her. It would be up to Lisa whether to reach out. Merrick nodded, understanding the boundaries. Dr. Abrams provided a notepad, and Merrick wrote down his name, address, and phone number. Was there anything else about Imelda that stood out? Merrick asked as he handed the notepad back. Anything that might help me understand this connection better? Dr. Abrams considered the question. Mrs. Rennick was a very private person. She didn't speak much about her past, even to the staff she was closest to, but she did mention Eleanor often with great affection. He paused. There was one thing, though. She had a small photo album she kept by her bedside. After she passed, we packed up her belongings according to her instructions. Most were to be donated, but the album was to go to Eleanor. Merrick frowned. I never received any album. No, you wouldn't have. When we learned of Eleanor's passing, we tried to contact you, but our letters were returned. Eventually, the album went into storage with other unclaimed items. Dr. Abrams stood. It might still be there. Would you like me to check? Please, Merrick said, a new urgency in his voice. While Dr. Abrams was gone, Merrick sat quietly, his thoughts spinning. What might be in that album? And why had Imelda wanted Eleanor to have it? The questions multiplied, creating a web of mystery that seemed to center around Pindle, a cat who had somehow connected these disparate parts of his life. Dr. Abrams returned 15 minutes later, carrying a small, worn photo album bound in faded blue fabric. It was still in storage, he said, handing it to Merrick. As Imelda's closest living relative, it rightfully belongs to you now. Merrick accepted the album with a sense of reverence. It was lighter than he expected, its cover soft with age and handling. Thank you, he said, for this and for telling me about Pindle, about the cat. It means a great deal to know. Of course. Dr. Abrams walked him back to the reception area. At the door, he paused. Mr. Dolan, I've been in palliative care for 20 years. I've seen many things that science struggles to explain. Moments of clarity before death, shared experiences between patients in different rooms, visitors who appear only to the dying. Dr. Abrams's eyes held a thoughtful gravity. I don't claim to understand what brought that cat to Imelda, or what led him to you afterward. But I've learned not to dismiss such connections simply because they defy conventional explanation. Merrick nodded, grateful for the doctor's openness. Thank you again. Outside, the day had warmed, sunlight dappling the parking lot through the branches of mature oak trees. As Merrick approached his car, he could see Pindle sitting alert in the passenger seat, watching his approach with evident interest. When Merrick opened the door, Pindle immediately focused on the blue album in his hands, sniffing at it with unusual intensity. Yes, it belonged to her, Merrick said, settling into the driver's seat. Imelda, the woman you stayed with. The cat continued to examine the album, then looked up at Merrick with what seemed like expectation. All right, let's see what's inside, Merrick said, placing the album on his lap and opening it carefully. The first page held a single black and white photograph, a young woman, perhaps in her 20s, standing beside a vintage car. Her dark hair was styled in the fashion of the 1950s, and she wore a light-colored dress with a fitted waist and full skirt. She was laughing, her face turned slightly away from the camera, as if caught in a moment of genuine joy. Written beneath in faded blue ink was a simple caption, Imi, Summit Lake, 1954. Merrick turned the page. More photographs followed. Imelda as a young woman in various settings, at a dance hall, on a picnic, standing in front of a small bookstore. In many of the pictures, she was accompanied by other young people, their faces full of the optimism and energy of youth. But it was the photograph on the 5th page that made Merrick's breath catch. Imelda, a few years older now, standing in a garden with a child of perhaps 4 or 5. The little girl had Imelda's dark hair and smile. Written beneath, Elizabeth's 5th birthday, 1960. Elizabeth, Eleanor's mother, which would make Imelda not her aunt, Merrick whispered, understanding dawning. Her grandmother. He turned the pages more quickly now, watching as Elizabeth grew from a child to a teenager to a young woman. Then, abruptly, the photographs of Elizabeth stopped. The next several pages were empty, as if a chapter of Imelda's life had been erased, or as if she hadn't been present to document it. When the photographs resumed, they jumped ahead many years. Imelda, now in her 60s, grey-haired but still recognizable, and beside her in several pictures, a young Eleanor, from childhood through her teenage years. The final photograph in the album showed Imelda and Eleanor together, standing in front of the very building Merrick had just left, Emmanuel Care Home. Eleanor looked much as she had when Merrick first met her, which would place the photo about 25 years ago. Written beneath in Eleanor's familiar handwriting, Grandma Immy's New Home 2000. Merrick closed the album, his mind reeling. Eleanor had never spoken of Imelda as her grandmother, only as a distant aunt. Why the deception? What had happened in those missing years, when Elizabeth disappeared from the photos? He looked at Pindle, who had settled back into the passenger seat, watching him with those inscrutable amber eyes. "There's more to this story," Merrick said softly. "And somehow you're connected to it all." Pindle blinked slowly, then turned to look out the windshield, as if suggesting it was time to go. The drive home was quiet, Merrick's thoughts too turbulent for the classical music he usually enjoyed. Instead, he drove in silence, occasionally glancing at Pindle, who seemed content to watch the familiar landscape pass by. As they turned onto Cedar Lane, approaching the modest 2-story house Merrick had shared with Eleanor for over 30 years, something caught his eye. A car was parked in his driveway, a small white sedan that looked familiar. "Is that?" Merrick murmured, slowing as they approached. Standing beside the car was a woman in her 50s with salt and pepper hair pulled back in a practical bun. She wore casual clothes now instead of scrubs, but Merrick recognized her immediately as the woman from the market parking lot, Lisa Hargrove, L.H. She turned as Merrick's car pulled up beside her, her expression a mixture of apprehension and determination. When she saw Pindle in the passenger seat, her face softened visibly. "Mr. Dolan," she said, as Merrick stepped out of the car, "I hope you don't mind the intrusion. Dr. Abrams called me after your visit. He thought it might be important for us to talk." Merrick nodded, his curiosity overshadowing any irritation at her uninvited presence. "I was hoping to find you," he said. "I have questions about your note." Lisa's gaze shifted to Pindle, who was watching her intently through the car window. "I can see why," she said softly. "It's not every day you discover your cat has a history like his." "Would you like to come inside?" Merrick offered, gesturing toward the house. "I think this might be a conversation best had sitting down." Lisa nodded gratefully. As Merrick opened the passenger door to let Pindle out, the cat immediately approached Lisa, rubbing against her legs with evident recognition. "Hello, old friend," she murmured, kneeling to stroke his fur. "I wondered if you'd remember me." Inside, Merrick led Lisa to the living room, a comfortable space with well-worn furniture and bookshelves lining 2 walls. It still bore the touches of Eleanor's decorating, floral cushions, landscape paintings, delicate figurines arranged on shelves, though Merrick had changed little in the years since her death. Lisa sat on the edge of the sofa, while Merrick took his usual armchair. Pindle, after a moment's consideration, jumped onto the sofa beside Lisa, curling up as if he'd done so many times before. "He remembers you," Merrick observed. Lisa smiled, a hint of sadness in her eyes. "We spent a lot of time together during those 9 days with Imelda. I worked the night shift when the facility was quiet, and there were fewer staff around. It was easier then to bend the rules a bit regarding our unexpected visitor. Dr. Abrams mentioned you were the one who advocated for letting him stay. I've been a hospice nurse for 15 years, Mr. Dolan. I've learned to recognize what brings comfort at the end. And this cat," she stroked Pindle's head, "he brought Imelda more peace than any medication we could provide." Merrick hesitated, then decided to share his discovery. I just learned that Imelda was actually my wife's grandmother, not her aunt, as Eleanor always claimed. I found photographs. He gestured to the blue album he'd placed on the coffee table. There seems to be a whole history here that Eleanor never shared with me. Lisa's expression registered surprise, then understanding. That explains a lot, actually. Imelda spoke of Eleanor often, especially toward the end, but there was always a sense of regret, I suppose, as if their relationship had been complicated. Do you know why? What happened between them? Lisa shook her head. Imelda kept her secrets close. But she did tell me one thing during those final days when the cat was with her. She said she was waiting for a sign of forgiveness. Forgiveness for what? She never said. But on her last night, Lisa's voice caught, and she took a moment to compose herself. On her last night, she was more lucid than she had been in days. The cat was curled against her side, purring. She stroked him and said, "Eleanor sent you, didn't she?" As if she believed the cat was some kind of messenger. Merrick felt a chill run through him. Eleanor had been dead for 3 years by then. How could she have sent anything? "I know how it sounds," Lisa said, reading his expression. "But in hospice care you learn not to dismiss the experiences of the dying. Their perception shifts as they approach the threshold. They often see or sense things we can't. And you think, what? That Pindle was somehow sent by Eleanor's spirit to comfort her grandmother?" Lisa smiled gently. "I don't claim to know what happened, Mr. Dolan. I only know what I witnessed. A cat who appeared from nowhere during a storm, who went directly to one specific room out of dozens, who provided extraordinary comfort to a dying woman, and who disappeared immediately after her death. And then, months later, I see this same cat sitting in your car, the widower of Imelda's granddaughter. You can call it coincidence if you like. I tend to think it's something more." Merrick sat back in his chair, his gaze moving between Lisa and Pindle. The cat was watching him steadily, those amber eyes seeming to hold secrets just beyond Merrick's understanding. "What about the 4-leaf clover?" Merrick asked suddenly, remembering the small drawing at the bottom of Lisa's note. "What does that mean?" A shadow passed over Lisa's face. That was Imelda's symbol in a way. She had a small tattoo of a 4-leaf clover on her wrist, unusual for a woman of her generation. She kept it covered most of the time, but during her care, of course, we saw it. When I asked about it once, she said it represented the 4 people she had truly loved in her life, and the luck she'd had in knowing them, despite everything. 4 people, Merrick mused. Her husband, I presume, Elizabeth, her daughter, Eleanor, and the 4th. Lisa shook her head. She never said. But she did tell me once that she had lost each of them in different ways. Some to death, some to choices she'd made that couldn't be undone. The afternoon light was fading now, casting long shadows across the living room. Pindle stretched and jumped down from the sofa, padding toward the kitchen as if suggesting it was time for his dinner. "I should go," Lisa said, rising. "I've taken enough of your time, and I'm sure this has all been overwhelming." Merrick stood as well. "Thank you for coming, for explaining. It helps to understand where Pindle came from, even if I don't fully understand why he came to me." At the door, Lisa paused. "There's one more thing, Mr. Dolan. The day Imelda died, after Pindle disappeared, I found something strange on her bedside table. A folded piece of paper that hadn't been there before. On it was written an address. This address. Your address." She met his gaze directly. "I never mentioned it to anyone. It seemed too inexplicable, but I've thought about it often since then." Before Merrick could respond, Lisa handed him a small card. "My number, if you have more questions, or if you just want to share news of how he's doing." She glanced toward the kitchen, where Pindle could be heard gently pawing at his food cabinet. After Lisa left, Merrick stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching her car disappear down Cedar Lane. The evening was drawing in, the first stars appearing in the deepening blue sky. From somewhere in the distance came the melancholy call of a mourning dove. He returned to the living room and picked up the blue photo album, studying again the images of Imelda's life, the visible parts at least. What had happened in those missing years? What had created the rift between her and her daughter, Elizabeth? And why had Eleanor maintained the fiction that Imelda was merely a distant aunt? Pindle appeared in the doorway, his dinner apparently finished, and jumped onto the arm of Merrick's chair. He nudged Merrick's hand, as if sensing his troubled thoughts. "What are you trying to tell me, old fellow?" Merrick murmured, scratching behind the cat's ears. "What am I supposed to understand from all this?" Pindle blinked slowly, then settled more comfortably against Merrick's side. Outside, the morning dove called again, its soft, plaintive notes hanging in the evening air like an unanswered question. Thursday mornings had always been Merrick's time at the Willow Glen Senior Center. For the past 5 years, he'd volunteered in their small library, delivering books to residents who had difficulty getting around and reading aloud to those whose eyesight had failed them. It was a commitment he'd maintained even after Eleanor's death, one of the few social activities he hadn't abandoned in his grief. This Thursday, however, as he prepared for his usual visit, Merrick felt a strange reluctance. His mind was still swirling with the revelations of the previous day, Imelda's true relationship to Eleanor, the mysterious appearance and disappearance of Pindle at the care home, Lisa Hargrove's suggestion that something beyond ordinary explanation was at work. "Maybe I should skip today," he said aloud, standing in the kitchen in his bathrobe, coffee cooling on the counter beside him. "Take some time to think." Pindle, who had been washing his face with methodical care, stopped and looked up at Merrick with what seemed like disapproval. "You think I should go anyway?" Merrick asked, smiling faintly at his own tendency to interpret the cat's expressions as responses. "Stick to the routine." Pindle resumed his grooming and Merrick took it as affirmation. "All right then, the usual Thursday it is." An hour later, freshly showered and dressed in comfortable corduroys and a sweater against the autumn chill, Merrick stood at the front door, car keys in hand. Pindle sat beside him, tail curled neatly around his paws. "Want to come along today?" Merrick asked, surprised by his own suggestion. He'd never taken Pindle to the senior center before. Unsure of the facility's policy on animals and concerned about the potential reactions of residents with allergies or fears. Pindle stood immediately, stretching with deliberate slowness, before moving to the door. "I'll take that as a yes," Merrick said. "But you'll have to stay in the car if they don't allow visitors of the feline variety." The Willow Glen Senior Center occupied what had once been the town's elementary school, a sturdy brick building with large windows and a covered portico. The playground equipment had been replaced with accessible gardens and seating areas, but the building retained its warm, institutional charm. As Merrick pulled into his usual parking spot, he noticed unusual activity near the main entrance. An ambulance, its lights flashing silently, and several staff members standing in a small cluster, their expressions concerned. "Something's happened," he murmured to Pindle, who was watching the scene with evident interest. "Maybe we should come back another time." But even as he spoke, Merrick recognized Doris Chen, the center's director, among the group. She looked up as if sensing his gaze, and after a brief word to her colleagues began walking toward his car. "Looks like we're going to find out what's going on," Merrick said, rolling down his window as Doris approached. "Merrick, thank goodness," Doris said, her normally composed features tight with worry. "I was about to call you. Is everything all right?" "I saw the ambulance." "It's Margaret Simmons," Doris said, naming one of the center's oldest residents, a former schoolteacher who, at 92, still possessed a razor-sharp mind despite her frail physical condition. "She had some kind of episode during breakfast. The paramedics think it might have been a minor stroke." Merrick felt a pang of concern. Margaret was one of his regular reading companions, a lover of poetry with a particular fondness for Robert Frost. "Is she going to be all right?" "They think so, but they're taking her to County General for tests. The thing is, Merrick—" Doris hesitated, her gaze moving past him to Pindle, who was watching her intently from the passenger seat. "Is that your cat?" "Yes, this is Pindle," Merrick said, surprised by the sudden change of subject. "I hope it's all right that I brought him. I can take him home if—" "No, no," Doris interrupted, a strange expression crossing her face. "Actually, this might be— Would you mind bringing him inside, just for a moment?" Merrick blinked in surprise. "Inside? Are you sure? I know some of the residents might have allergies or—" "It's just that Margaret's been asking for her cat since her episode," Doris explained. "We've tried to tell her she doesn't have a cat, hasn't had one for years, but she's quite insistent. The paramedics are concerned about her agitation. I thought perhaps if she saw your cat, it might calm her enough for transport." Merrick glanced at Pindle, who seemed to be following the conversation with unusual attentiveness. "I suppose we could try," he said slowly, "if you think it would help." "Thank you," Doris said, relief evident in her voice. "They're about to move her to the ambulance. If you could bring him quickly." "Of course." Merrick got out of the car and opened the passenger door. Pindle jumped down without hesitation, as if he'd been expecting the invitation. Together they followed Doris across the parking lot and through the main entrance. The center's common room, usually filled with residents engaged in various activities, was strangely quiet, most of the occupants having gathered near the dining area where the commotion was centered. "She's over here," Doris said, leading them toward a small crowd of staff and paramedics clustered around a wheelchair. In the chair sat Margaret Simmons, her thin frame seeming even smaller than usual, her white hair disheveled. Her hands, spotted with age but still elegant, moved restlessly in her lap as a paramedic checked her blood pressure. "Margaret," Doris said gently, approaching the elderly woman. "Merrick Dolan is here, and he's brought a visitor who might like to meet you." Margaret looked up, her pale blue eyes clouded with confusion. "Merrick?" "From the library." Her gaze moved past him, searching. "Where's Pippin? They said Pippin was coming." Merrick felt a jolt of surprise. "Pippin?" She'd asked for her cat, but named one that wasn't hers. Before he could respond, Pindle moved forward on his own, approaching Margaret's wheelchair with deliberate steps. The paramedics tensed, but Doris made a small gesture for them to wait. Margaret's restless hands stilled as she caught sight of the orange cat. Her expression transformed, confusion giving way to wonder and then to a tremulous smile. "Pippin," she whispered, reaching out a shaking hand. "You came back, after all this time." Pindle approached the wheelchair, and to everyone's astonishment, rose up on his hind legs to place his front paws gently on Margaret's knees. With graceful precision, he then jumped into her lap, turning once before settling there, his amber eyes fixed on her face. Margaret's entire body seemed to relax. She stroked Pindle's fur with trembling fingers, tears gathering in her eyes. "I knew you'd come," she murmured. "I told them you would." The paramedics exchanged glances of bewilderment, but Merrick noticed that Margaret's color had improved, her breathing steadied. The cat sat perfectly still in her lap, accepting her caresses with a quiet dignity that seemed almost ceremonial. "Her vitals are stabilizing," one of the paramedics said quietly to his colleague. "Blood pressure's coming down." "Margaret," Doris said gently, "the doctors still need to examine you at the hospital. Would it be all right if the paramedics take you now? I promise Pippin will be here when you return." Margaret nodded, her gaze still fixed on Pindle. "You'll wait for me?" she asked the cat, as if expecting an answer. Pindle blinked slowly at her, then butted his head gently against her hand. "He'll wait," Merrick found himself saying, though he had no idea why he felt so certain of this. "He'll be here when you come back." With that assurance, Margaret allowed the paramedics to prepare her for transport. Pindle jumped down from her lap only when they needed to secure her on the gurney, but he remained close, watching the proceedings with evident concern. As they wheeled Margaret toward the exit, she reached out one last time, her fingers brushing Pindle's head. "Thank you for remembering," she whispered. "All these years and you remembered." Then she was gone, the ambulance doors closing behind her with a soft thud. In the silence that followed, Merrick became aware of the stares directed at him and Pindle, curious, confused, and in some cases faintly suspicious. "Well?" Doris said finally, her voice unnaturally bright. "That was certainly helpful. Thank you, Merrick. And you too, Pindle." "Doris," Merrick said quietly as the small crowd began to disperse, "did Margaret ever have an orange cat named Pippin?" A shadow passed over Doris's face. "Not in the time she's been at the center. She's been here nearly 10 years, and I've never known her to mention a cat until today." She hesitated. "But I suppose she might have had one years ago before coming here." Merrick nodded, though the explanation felt insufficient. How had Margaret recognized Pindle so immediately if she hadn't seen him before? And why had she called him Pippin, a name that Pindle had responded to as if it were his own? "I think I'll skip the library today if that's all right," Merrick said, suddenly feeling the need for quiet reflection. After all this excitement. "Of course," Doris agreed, "though perhaps you could come back tomorrow. Several of our residents look forward to your visits, especially now that we're short-staffed." "I'll be here," Merrick promised, "and maybe Pindle will join me again if that's allowed." Doris glanced at the cat, who sat watching them with that steady, unnerving gaze. "I think after today we can make an exception to our usual policy. He seems to have a calming effect." As Merrick drove home, Pindle rode in unusual silence, his typical interest in passing scenery replaced by what seemed like deep contemplation. Or perhaps, Merrick thought, he was merely projecting his own tumultuous feelings onto the animal. "Pippin," he said aloud, testing the name. "Was that you once? Is that who you were to Margaret?" Pindle offered no response beyond a slow blink. Back home, Merrick found himself too restless for his usual routines. Instead of settling into his armchair with a book, he wandered from room to room, his thoughts churning. First Imelda, now Margaret, two elderly women in the final chapter of their lives, both recognizing Pindle as if he were a long-lost companion. What did it mean? Eventually, his wandering led him to Eleanor's study, a small room off the living room that he'd left largely untouched since her death. Her desk remained as she'd left it, neat and organized, with family photographs arranged along the back edge and a small potted plant, long since dried up, still sitting in the corner. Merrick stood in the doorway, memories washing over him. Eleanor had spent countless hours in this room grading papers — she'd taught high school English until her retirement — and writing the poetry she'd never felt confident enough to publish. It had been her sanctuary, and after her death Merrick had found he couldn't bear to disturb it, as if preserving the space might somehow preserve a piece of her. Pindle appeared beside him, looking into the room with evident curiosity. Then, without hesitation, the cat walked in and jumped onto Eleanor's desk chair, turning to face Merrick as if inviting him to follow. "You think there are answers in here?" Merrick asked, stepping into the room for what felt like the first time in years. He moved to the desk, running his fingers lightly over its polished surface. Eleanor had been meticulously organized, keeping her papers in labeled folders, her correspondence in neat bundles tied with ribbon. After her death, Merrick had dealt with the practical matters — bills, insurance documents, legal papers — but had left her personal items untouched. Now, guided by some instinct he couldn't name, he opened the middle drawer of the desk. Inside were the expected items: pens, paperclips, sticky notes. But there was also a small leather-bound journal he didn't recognize, its cover worn smooth with handling. Merrick lifted it out carefully. The journal was locked, a tiny brass key required to open the clasp that held it closed. He had never seen it before, had never known Eleanor kept such a private record. "Where would she have put the key?" he murmured, looking around the desk. Pindle, still perched on the chair, made a soft sound and jumped down, moving to the small bookshelf that stood against the wall. He pawed at the lowest shelf, where a row of Eleanor's favorite poetry collections stood neatly aligned. Merrick knelt beside the cat, pulling out the volumes one by one. Behind the books, tucked against the wall, was a small brass key attached to a faded blue ribbon. "How did you know?" Merrick whispered, looking at Pindle with renewed wonder. But the cat had already returned to the desk chair, watching expectantly. With trembling fingers, Merrick inserted the key into the journal's lock. It turned with a soft click, and the clasp sprang open. Inside, Eleanor's familiar handwriting filled page after page, the entries dated sporadically over the last 5 years of her life. Merrick hesitated, a sense of trepidation washing over him. This had been Eleanor's private thoughts, never meant for his eyes. Did he have the right to read them now? But then his gaze fell on an entry dated just a week before her sudden death from a heart attack. The words leapt out at him. "I dreamed of Grandma Immy again last night. She was sitting in her garden, the one behind the house on Maple Street. Though it's been gone for decades now. She looked young, like in the photographs from before everything fell apart." She said, "It's time to tell him, Eleanor, before it's too late. I knew she meant Merrick and the secret I've kept all these years, but how can I tell him now? How can I explain that everything he knows about my family is built on silence and half-truths?" Merrick sat heavily in Eleanor's chair, the journal open in his hands, as the implications of her words sank in. Eleanor had been planning to tell him something significant about her family, about Imelda. But death had intervened before she could. And now somehow Pindle had led him to this journal, to this entry, as if the cat were trying to complete what Eleanor had begun. "What was the secret, Eleanor?" Merrick whispered to the empty room. "What didn't you tell me?" Pindle jumped onto the desk, settling beside the journal, his amber eyes fixed on Merrick with that unsettling intelligence. Outside, rain began to fall, soft drops pattering against the windows like gentle encouragement to read on, to uncover what had been hidden for so long. With a deep breath, Merrick turned the page, prepared to finally learn the truth about Eleanor's past, about Imelda, and perhaps even about the mysterious cat who seemed determined to bring these long-buried secrets into the light. Rain continued to fall as afternoon deepened into evening, creating a cocoon of sound around the house, a gentle percussion that seemed to underscore the gravity of Merrick's discovery. He had moved from Eleanor's study to the living room, settling into his familiar armchair with the journal cradled in his hands. Pindle lay curled on the ottoman beside him, occasionally opening one eye as if to check Merrick's progress through the pages. The journal was not a daily record, but rather a sporadic collection of entries, sometimes months apart, focused primarily on Eleanor's thoughts about her family. Merrick read slowly, absorbing each revelation with a mixture of sorrow and wonder at how little he had known of his wife's inner struggles. From the scattered entries, a story emerged, one of family secrets, profound grief, and the weight of silence carried across generations. Imelda Rennick, Eleanor's grandmother, had been born in 1933 to a working-class family in rural Oregon. Bright and ambitious, she had won a scholarship to study nursing, unusual for a woman of her background in that era. At 19, she had married Thomas Rennick, a young man from a more affluent family who was studying to become a doctor. In 1955, they had a daughter, Elizabeth, Eleanor's mother. By all outward appearances, they were the perfect small-town family, respected doctor, dedicated nurse, and their precocious child. But beneath this veneer lay a more complicated reality. Thomas Rennick had returned from military service in Korea, a changed man, struggling with what would now be recognized as PTSD. His moods were unpredictable, his temper sometimes frightening. Imelda had protected Elizabeth as best she could, creating a buffer between her volatile husband and their sensitive daughter. Then came the entry that made Merrick's heart constrict. Grandma Immy told me once, when I was about 16, what happened the night everything changed. It was 1960, the same year as the photograph in her album, where she and Mom looked so happy in the garden. Dad, Thomas, had been drinking. His nightmares had been worse that week. Mom was 5, playing with her cat, an orange tabby named Pippin that followed her everywhere. Thomas tripped over a toy, already angry about something at the hospital. When Pippin hissed at him, Grandma couldn't finish the story, but I understood. That gentle cat had tried to protect my mother, and Thomas killed it in his rage. Mom screamed and tried to save Pippin. Thomas pushed her aside and she fell, hitting her head on the corner of the coffee table. Grandma took Mom and fled that night, leaving everything behind. They never saw Thomas again. He died 2 years later. Heart attack, they said, but Grandma always wondered if it wasn't his guilt that killed him. Mom never spoke of that night, but she was never the same. The bright, curious child became withdrawn, prone to dark moods, and she never had another pet, not once in her entire life. Merrick looked up from the journal, his vision blurred with tears. He glanced at Pindle, who was watching him with those solemn amber eyes. "Pippin," Merrick whispered. "Margaret called you Pippin today." The cat blinked slowly, offering neither confirmation nor denial. Merrick returned to the journal, reading how Elizabeth had grown into a troubled young woman, struggling with what would later be diagnosed as bipolar disorder. She had married young, to a kind but overwhelmed man who eventually left when Eleanor was only 7. Elizabeth's condition had worsened, requiring periodic hospitalizations. During those times, Eleanor had lived with Imelda, forming a bond with her grandmother that became her emotional anchor. But there was another layer to the story, one that explained the estrangement between Imelda and Elizabeth, and why Eleanor had always referred to Imelda as a distant aunt rather than her grandmother. Mom blamed Grandma Immy for everything that went wrong in her life. She created a narrative where Grandma had torn apart a happy family, taking her away from a father who loved her. The truth, Thomas's violence, Pippin's death, her own injury, was too painful to acknowledge. By the time I was a teenager, Mom had cut Grandma Immy out of our lives completely, made me promise to do the same, but I couldn't. I visited in secret, writing letters under a friend's name. When I met Merrick, I continued the deception. Easier to describe Immy as a distant aunt than to explain the tangled web of family trauma. Merrick, so straightforward and honest, would never understand such deliberate lies between family members. How could he, coming from his loving, uncomplicated family? And so the pattern continues, secrets kept, truths hidden. Sometimes I think there's a curse on the women in my family, each generation carrying the wounds of the one before. The final entries in the journal revealed Eleanor's growing desire to break this cycle of secrecy. After Elizabeth's death 5 years earlier, she had begun visiting Imelda more openly, though she still maintained the fiction of the aunt relationship to Merrick. In her last entry, just days before her fatal heart attack, Eleanor had written of her decision to finally tell Merrick everything. "I dreamed of Pippin last night, Mom's childhood cat, the one whose death marked the beginning of all our family sorrows. In the dream, he was sitting on our porch waiting, not young as he would have been then, but old, wise. He looked at me with such knowing eyes, as if to say, 'It's time. The secrets have done their damage. Let them go. Tomorrow I'll tell Merrick everything, about Grandma Immy and Thomas, about Mom's illness and my childhood shuttling between them, about the small deceptions that grew into walls between us. I'm afraid, what if he can't forgive the lies? But I'm more afraid of leaving this world with the truth still buried. Some burdens aren't meant to be carried alone, or passed down to the next generation." But tomorrow had never come for Eleanor. A heart attack in her sleep had taken her that very night, leaving her secrets still locked in the journal, her intentions unfulfilled, until now. Merrick closed the journal slowly, overwhelmed by all he had learned. The rain had stopped, leaving a profound silence broken only by the occasional drip from the eaves. Evening had fully descended, the room lit only by the small lamp beside his chair, casting Pindle's shadow long across the floor. "An orange cat named Pippin," Merrick said softly, looking at the feline curled on the ottoman, "who tried to protect a little girl and was killed for it. And now, decades later, an orange cat appears in the life of that little girl's granddaughter, and then in mine." Pindle raised his head, meeting Merrick's gaze with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. "What are you?" Merrick whispered. "A coincidence? A reincarnation? Or something else entirely?" The cat offered no answer beyond a slow blink, but somehow, in the quiet of the lamplit room, that seemed enough. Whatever Pindle was, ordinary cat or something more mysterious, he had led Merrick to truths long buried, connections that might otherwise have remained hidden forever. Rising from his chair, journal in hand, Merrick moved to the window. The rain had cleared, leaving a night sky studded with stars, their light seeming especially bright after the long grey day. The street was quiet, most houses dark except for the soft glow of porch lights. In this peaceful moment, Merrick felt a curious lightness, as if in uncovering Eleanor's secrets he had somehow released something held too long in shadow. "She wanted to tell me," he said, still looking at the stars. "She was ready to share it all. And now somehow she has." From behind him came the soft thump of Pindle jumping down from the ottoman, followed by the gentle pad of paws across the hardwood floor. The cat appeared at his side, sitting tall and straight, his amber eyes reflecting the starlight. In that moment, Merrick felt a presence that transcended the physical, a sense of connection not just to Pindle, but to Eleanor, to Imelda, to all the tangled threads of love and loss that had brought him to this point. For the first time since Eleanor's death, the grief that had been his constant companion felt transmuted into something else, something that honored her memory without binding him to sorrow. "Thank you," he said, both to the cat and to whatever forces had brought them together, "for helping me understand." Pindle blinked slowly, then turned and walked toward the hallway, pausing at the entrance to look back expectantly. "Yes," Merrick said, understanding the unspoken suggestion. "It's late. Time for sleep." That night, for the first time since finding the mysterious note attached to Pindle's collar, Merrick slept deeply and without dreams. And when he woke in the morning, he found the cat not in his usual spot at the foot of the bed, but curled in the center of Eleanor's pillow, as if keeping watch over her place. Friday dawned bright and clear, the storm having washed away both clouds and the lingering heat of early autumn. Merrick rose early, feeling more rested than he had in weeks, perhaps months. The revelations of the previous day, while painful, had also brought a curious sense of resolution, as if pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known he was solving had finally clicked into place. After a simple breakfast of toast and coffee, Merrick sat at the kitchen table, Eleanor's journal open before him. Pindle sat in the chair opposite, watching with that steady, unblinking gaze that no longer seemed merely feline. "I want to go back to the senior centre today," Merrick said, thinking aloud. "I promised Doris I would, and I'd like to check on Margaret, see if she's returned from the hospital." Pindle's ears perked forward at the mention of Margaret's name. "You'd like to see her again too, wouldn't you?" Merrick observed. "There's a connection there, though I'm not sure what it is yet." The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Doris Chen from the senior centre. "Merrick," she said, her voice warm but tinged with something like wonder. "I hope I'm not calling too early." "Not at all, I was just planning my day." Merrick cradled the receiver between ear and shoulder, watching as Pindle stretched leisurely on the chair opposite. "I wanted to let you know that Margaret is back from the hospital," Doris continued. "The doctors found no sign of a stroke, thankfully. They think it might have been a TIA, a mini-stroke, or possibly just a drop in blood pressure. She's a bit tired, but otherwise seems fine." "That's wonderful news," Merrick said sincerely. He had always enjoyed his time with Margaret, her sharp mind and dry wit, a refreshing contrast to some of the centre's more forgetful residents. "There's something else," Doris said, her voice lowering slightly. "Something unusual. Margaret has been asking for your cat since she returned, specifically asking for Pippin. I told her I'd check if you might be visiting today." Merrick felt a chill run through him despite the morning sunlight streaming through the kitchen windows. Pippin, the name from Eleanor's journal, the cat who had died defending a small girl more than 60 years ago. "We'll be there," he heard himself saying. "Around 10, if that works." "Perfect," Doris replied, relief evident in her voice. "And, Merrick, thank you. I know it's an unusual request." After hanging up, Merrick sat in silence for a long moment, his thoughts racing. The coincidences were piling up, becoming too numerous and too specific to dismiss. First, Imelda Rennick, recognizing Pindle during her final days. Then the note leading Merrick to discover Eleanor's hidden family history. Now Margaret Simmons, calling Pindle by a name she couldn't possibly know, the name of a cat that had died decades before she'd ever met Merrick or Pindle. "What are you?" Merrick asked again, looking directly at Pindle. "And what am I supposed to do with all of this?" The cat, predictably, offered no verbal response, but rose and moved to the door with clear purpose, looking back as if to say, "Let's find out." The drive to the senior centre was peaceful, the morning traffic light, the autumn colours of Willow Glen's tree-lined streets especially vibrant after the rain. Pindle sat in his usual spot on the passenger seat, but his attention seemed focused inward rather than on the passing scenery. At the centre, Doris met them at the entrance, her expression a mixture of relief and curiosity. "Margaret's in the sunroom," she said after greeting them both. "She's been watching the door all morning." Merrick followed her through the building's main hallway, Pindle walking beside him with unusual decorum, as if aware of the importance of the moment. Residents and staff they passed turned to watch the cat with expressions ranging from delight to mild alarm, but Pindle paid them no mind, his focus entirely on the path ahead. The sunroom was a pleasant space at the back of the building, 3 walls of windows overlooking a small garden where late roses still bloomed against a backdrop of ornamental grasses and evergreen shrubs. Several residents sat in comfortable chairs, reading or simply enjoying the morning light, but Merrick's attention was immediately drawn to Margaret Simmons. She sat in her wheelchair near the centre of the room, a crocheted blanket across her knees, despite the warmth of the sunlight streaming through the windows. At 92, Margaret was fragile physically, her once tall frame now bent with osteoporosis, her hands gnarled with arthritis. But her mind remained sharp, her pale blue eyes alert behind wire-rimmed glasses that had been fashionable decades earlier. Those eyes lit up the moment she saw Merrick and Pindle enter the room. "You came," she said, her voice quavering slightly but warm with genuine pleasure. "Both of you?" "Of course," Merrick replied, approaching her wheelchair. "Doris said you were asking for us." Margaret's gaze moved past him to focus on Pindle, who had stopped a few feet away, watching her with evident interest. "For him, mostly," she admitted with a small smile. "Though your company is always welcome, Merrick." "She's been talking about that cat all morning," said Walter Jenkins, an 84-year-old former accountant who occupied his usual chair by the east windows, going on about how he's some cat she knew 60 years ago. Told her cats don't live that long, but she wouldn't hear it. Margaret shot Walter an irritated glance. I know perfectly well how long cats live, Walter Jenkins. I taught biology for 40 years. She turned back to Merrick, her expression softening. Would you mind if I spoke with you privately? Perhaps in my room? Of course, Merrick agreed, sensing the importance of whatever Margaret wanted to share. With Doris's help, they relocated to Margaret's small private room down the hall. It was a pleasant space, personalized with photographs, books, and a few cherished pieces of furniture she'd brought from her home when she'd moved to the center a decade earlier. A large window overlooked the center's garden, and Margaret's wheelchair was positioned to take advantage of this view. Once Doris had left them, closing the door with a discreet click, Margaret turned to Merrick with an intensity that belied her frail appearance. Your cat, she said without preamble. Where did you find him? At the library, Merrick answered, seeing no reason to dissemble. In a storage room about 6 months ago. He seemed to have no owner, so I took him home. Margaret nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something she'd suspected. And you named him Pindle? Yes, after a character in one of my wife's favorite books. But that's not his real name, Margaret said, her gaze moving to Pindle, who had settled on the floor beside her wheelchair, watching her with evident interest. His name is Pippin. Merrick felt his heart rate quicken. Why do you think that? Margaret smiled, a hint of her former vigor animating her features. Because I knew Pippin. Many years ago, when I was just starting my teaching career at Willow Glen Elementary, I taught a little girl named Elizabeth Rennick. She was in my first grade class. Merrick couldn't suppress a small gasp. Elizabeth, Eleanor's mother. The little girl from the journal entries whose beloved cat had been killed the night her family fell apart. Elizabeth was a bright child, Margaret continued, her voice taking on the rhythmic cadence of a practiced storyteller. Sensitive, imaginative. She talked often about her cat Pippin, an orange tabby who followed her everywhere. She even wrote a story about him for class, about how he was actually a magical cat who could travel through time, appearing whenever someone needed him most. She paused, her gaze distant with memory. Then, midway through the school year, Elizabeth changed, became withdrawn, sometimes prone to outbursts. Her mother, Imelda, told me they'd moved suddenly, left Elizabeth's father, that Elizabeth was having trouble adjusting. But there was more to it than that. I could tell. Children carry their sorrows differently than adults. Did Elizabeth ever tell you what happened? Merrick asked softly. Margaret shook her head. Not directly, but one day, during art time, she drew a picture, a terrible scene of a man hurting an orange cat, a little girl crying. When I asked her about it, she tore it up and refused to speak for the rest of the day. She sighed heavily. It was the 1960s. We didn't have the resources, the understanding of childhood trauma that exists now. I did what I could, but Elizabeth left Willow Glen with her mother at the end of that school year. I never saw her again. Merrick absorbed this information in silence. Another piece of the puzzle, another connection linking Pindle to Eleanor's family history. When I saw your cat yesterday, Margaret continued, it was like seeing Pippin from Elizabeth's drawings, the same orange fur, the same intelligent eyes, and I remembered her story, about the magical cat who traveled through time to help people. She smiled apologetically. I know how it sounds. At my age, people assume any confusion is the beginning of dementia. But my mind is still clear, Merrick. And I know what I saw, what I see now. Pindle chose that moment to rise and place his front paws gently on Margaret's knees, looking up at her with those unblinking amber eyes. With trembling hands, she stroked his head. I don't know if he's really the same cat from Elizabeth's imagination, she said softly, or if there's some other explanation, but I believe there are mysteries in this world that go beyond our understanding. Don't you? Merrick thought of the note attached to Pindle's collar, of Imelda recognizing the cat in her final days, of Eleanor's hidden journal appearing just when he needed its truths. Yes, he said simply. I'm beginning to. They sat in companionable silence for a few minutes, Margaret continuing to stroke Pindle's fur, the cat accepting her attention with dignified patience. Did you ever meet Eleanor? Merrick asked suddenly. Elizabeth's daughter. My wife. Margaret's expression brightened. Eleanor Dolan, the English teacher at the high school. When Merrick nodded, she continued, Of course, I didn't make the connection with your last name. We served on the curriculum committee together before I retired. Brilliant woman, wonderful teacher. Her expression softened. I was so sorry to hear of her passing, though I never knew she was Elizabeth's daughter. She never mentioned it. There was a lot she didn't mention, Merrick said, a hint of sadness in his voice. Family secrets that she carried her whole life. Ah, Margaret nodded in understanding. The burdens we inherit, often without knowing their true weight. She looked again at Pindle. Perhaps that's why he's here now, to help unburden what's been carried too long. Before Merrick could respond, there was a soft knock at the door. Doris peeked in, her expression apologetic. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but Margaret has her physical therapy session in 5 minutes," she said. "And Mrs. Abernathy in room 12 has been asking if Merrick might read to her today, as he usually does on Thursdays." "Of course," Merrick said, rising from his chair. "We shouldn't keep the therapist waiting." "Will you come again?" Margaret asked, looking not at Merrick but at Pindle. "Both of you?" "We will," Merrick promised. "Perhaps next Thursday for our regular visit." Margaret smiled, a girlish light brightening her aged features. "I'd like that, and perhaps by then I'll remember more about Elizabeth and her magical cat. The mind is funny that way. One memory often leads to others long forgotten." As Merrick and Pindle left Margaret's room, making their way toward Mrs. Abernathy's for the promised reading session, Merrick found himself overwhelmed by the growing web of connections centered around his seemingly ordinary cat. Elizabeth, Imelda, Eleanor, and now Margaret, women from different generations, their lives intersecting in ways he was only beginning to understand, with Pindle somehow at the center of it all. "A magical cat who travels through time, appearing when needed most," he murmured, glancing down at Pindle walking steadily beside him. "Is that what you are? A childhood fantasy come to life, or something else entirely?" Pindle, as always, kept his secrets, moving forward with purpose down the sunlit hallway toward whatever revelation awaited them next. Saturday brought with it a sense of anticipation that Merrick hadn't experienced in years. The discoveries of the past few days had awakened something in him, a curiosity, a desire to understand that had been dormant since Eleanor's death. The comfortable routines that had structured his days now felt like mere placeholders, a way of passing time rather than truly living it. After breakfast, Merrick returned to Eleanor's study, drawn by an instinct he couldn't quite name. Pindle followed, jumping onto the desk chair as he had before, watching as Merrick surveyed the room with new eyes. "There's more, isn't there?" Merrick said aloud. "More pieces to this puzzle." His gaze fell on the bookshelf where he'd found the key to Eleanor's journal. What else might be hidden there, tucked away behind the visible, the obvious? One by one, Merrick removed the books from the shelves, examining each carefully before setting it aside. Most were what he expected: poetry collections, literary classics, teaching references. But on the bottom shelf, behind a row of oversized art books, he found a small wooden box he'd never seen before. The box was simple but beautiful, made of polished cherry wood, with a small brass clasp. No lock this time, just a simple mechanism that opened with a gentle press. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, lay a collection of photographs, letters, and small mementos. Merrick lifted out the contents carefully, spreading them on Eleanor's desk. There were photographs he recognized, Eleanor as a child, as a young woman on their wedding day. But there were others he'd never seen. A young woman who must be Elizabeth, standing beside a stern-faced man who could only be Thomas Rennick. Imelda as a young nurse in a crisp white uniform. A small house with a garden where hollyhocks grew taller than the picket fence surrounding it. And then, at the bottom of the pile, a faded color photograph that made Merrick's breath catch. A little girl of perhaps 5 or 6 with dark hair in pigtails, Elizabeth, he assumed, sitting on a porch step, and beside her, an orange cat with distinctive amber eyes, looking directly at the camera with uncanny intelligence. Merrick turned the photograph over. Written in faded blue ink was a simple caption: "Elizabeth and Pippin, Spring, 1960. With trembling hands, he placed the photograph on the desk and sat back, overwhelmed by the implications. The resemblance between the cat in the 65-year-old photograph and Pindle was unmistakable. Not just the coloring, but the distinctive markings, the particular tilt of the head, the penetrating gaze. "It's impossible," Merrick whispered, looking from the photograph to Pindle, who had moved from the chair to the desk and was now sitting beside the scattered memories, watching Merrick with those same amber eyes. Cats don't live for 65 years. Yet the evidence was before him undeniable. Either this was the most extraordinary coincidence, or there was something about Pindle that defied conventional explanation, something that aligned with Elizabeth's childhood story about a magical cat who traveled through time, appearing when needed most. As Merrick struggled to make sense of what he was seeing, his attention was drawn to something else in the box, a small yellowed envelope with "For Eleanor" written on it in spidery handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of stationery, the letter dated just 2 weeks before Imelda's death. "My dearest Eleanor," it began, the handwriting shaky but determined. "As I approach the end of my life, I find myself thinking of beginnings, of the little girl I once was, full of dreams and certainties, and of the woman I became, shaped by choices both brave and cowardly. You asked me once why I kept the 4-leaf clover tattoo all these years, hidden though it was from most eyes. I told you it represented the 4 people I truly loved: Thomas, before the war changed him; Elizabeth, you, and one other I wouldn't name. The truth is both simpler and stranger. The 4th leaf was for Pippin, Elizabeth's cat, yes, but so much more than that. In my darkest hour, when I had to choose between my husband and my child, it was Pippin who showed me the way. His sacrifice that terrible night gave me the courage to take Elizabeth and leave, to begin again despite my fear. Over the years, in moments of greatest need, I've glimpsed him, an orange cat with knowing eyes, watching from a distance. After your mother's funeral, the day you graduated college, outside the hospital when you lost your first baby, brief appearances, gone when I looked again, easily dismissed as imagination or coincidence. But I know better. Some souls are too large, too compassionate, to be contained by ordinary limits of time and form. They return when needed, guides on our most difficult journeys. You'll think this the ramblings of an old woman near death, and perhaps it is. But remember this, my darling girl, there are more mysteries in this world than we can comprehend. And love, true, selfless love, is the greatest mystery of all, capable of transcending even death itself. Look for the signs. They're all around us if we have eyes to see. With all my love, Grandma Immy Merrick read the letter twice, then a third time, trying to absorb its implications. Imelda had believed that Pippin, Elizabeth's childhood cat, had somehow returned at various points throughout her life, appearing in moments of crisis or significant change. And now, an orange cat with the same distinctive appearance had come into Merrick's life after Eleanor's death, leading him to discover long-buried family secrets. "Is that what you are?" Merrick asked, looking at Pindle, who sat perfectly still, watching him with unblinking attention. "A guide? A messenger?" The cat offered no answer beyond his steady gaze, but in that moment Merrick felt a certainty that transcended logical explanation. Whatever Pindle was, ordinary cat or something more mysterious, he had appeared in Merrick's life for a reason, leading him through a labyrinth of discovery, toward some purpose not yet fully revealed. Gathering the photographs and letter, Merrick returned them to the wooden box, all except for the image of Elizabeth and Pippin, which he slipped into his shirt pocket. Something told him he might need it, though for what purpose he couldn't say. "Come on," he said to Pindle, who jumped down from the desk with fluid grace. "I think it's time we visited one more place." The Willow Glen Historical Society occupied the town's original library, a handsome brick building on Main Street that had been saved from demolition by determined local activists in the 1980s. Though small, its archives contained a wealth of local history: newspapers, photographs, municipal records, and personal accounts donated by long-time residents. Merrick had visited occasionally over the years, primarily when Eleanor was researching local history for her classes. Today, however, his purpose was more personal. If what he suspected was true, if Pindle was somehow connected to the cat that had been part of Eleanor's family history, perhaps there were other appearances, other instances where an unusual orange cat had featured in Willow Glen's past. The society was quiet on this Saturday afternoon, only a few visitors browsing the small museum area where glass cases displayed artifacts from the town's founding days. Behind the reception desk sat Harriet Milligan, the society's volunteer archivist, and at 84 a living repository of local knowledge. "Merrick Dolan," she said warmly as he approached, her magnified eyes blinking behind thick glasses. "What a pleasant surprise." "It's been, what, 3 years?" "At least," Merrick acknowledged with a smile. "You're looking well, Harriet." "Generous of you to say so." Her gaze moved past him to Pindle, who sat patiently at his feet. "And who's this handsome fellow? I didn't know you had a cat." "This is Pindle," Merrick said. "He's a relatively new addition. I hope it's all right that I brought him." "He's very well behaved." Harriet's face softened as she looked at the cat. "Well, normally we don't allow animals, but seeing as it's quiet today, and he does look like a gentleman." She leaned forward slightly. "You know, he reminds me of a cat from my childhood. Same orange coat, same dignified bearing." Merrick felt a flutter of excitement at her words. "That's actually related to why I'm here, Harriet. I'm researching something unusual. Stories or records about a distinctive orange cat appearing in Willow Glen over the years." Harriet's eyebrows rose above her glasses. "Well, that's certainly an original research topic. Any particular time period?" "As far back as possible," Merrick said. "Particularly around the 1960s, but earlier or later as well." Harriet tapped her chin thoughtfully. "The newspaper archives might be a place to start. We've digitized most of them now, so you can search by keyword. And there's the Willow Glen Gazette's Curious Incidents column that ran from the 1920s through the 1970s. Local oddities, unexplained events, that sort of thing. Popular before television provided more exciting entertainment." She led Merrick to a computer station in the corner of the reading room, showing him how to access the digital archives. "Just type your search terms here," she explained. "And if you need the physical archives, they're organized by decade in those cabinets along the wall." "Thank you, Harriet," Merrick said gratefully. "Not at all. It's refreshing to help with something beyond the usual genealogy requests." She glanced again at Pindle, who had settled beside Merrick's chair, his attention seemingly fixed on the computer screen. "Unusual cat, isn't he? Almost seems to understand what we're saying." "Yes," Merrick agreed simply. "He does." After Harriet returned to her desk, Merrick began his search, typing orange cat into the database. The results were numerous but mostly mundane. Lost pet notices, shelter announcements, the occasional feature on a local resident's beloved feline. Refining his search to unusual orange cat or mysterious cat yielded fewer results, but several caught his attention. He began taking notes, occasionally showing Pindle an article of particular interest, as if the cat might confirm or deny its relevance. From the Willow Glen Gazette, September 12, 1942. Local hero credits. Guardian angel cat with saving family from fire. Mr. Harold Jenkins of Oak Street credits what he describes as a persistent orange cat with saving his family from certain tragedy last Tuesday night. According to Jenkins, he was awakened around 2 a.m. by the sound of a cat scratching frantically at his bedroom window. Upon investigation, he discovered the back portion of his house had caught fire, allowing him time to evacuate his wife and 3 small children before the blaze engulfed the structure. The mysterious feline disappeared before firefighters arrived, and Jenkins, who owns no pets, has been unable to locate it to express his gratitude. "That cat knew exactly what it was doing," Jenkins told this reporter. "It wasn't just making noise, it was calling for help as plain as if it could speak." From the Curious Incidents column, May 3, 1957. Several attendees at last week's Founders' Day celebration reported an unusual occurrence during the moment of silence honoring Willow Glen's war dead. According to witnesses, an orange cat appeared on the memorial steps, sitting perfectly still throughout the ceremony before disappearing into the crowd. What makes this incident noteworthy is that the same cat, or one remarkably similar, has allegedly appeared at this ceremony for the past 3 years, always during the moment of silence, always departing immediately after. "It's as if it's paying respects," observed Mrs. Ethel Simmons, who first noticed the feline visitor in 1955. "Sounds fanciful, I know, but there's something almost reverent in the way it sits there, so still and dignified." The most compelling article, however, came from March 15, 1960, just weeks before the night described in Eleanor's journal, when Thomas Rennick had killed Elizabeth's cat in a fit of rage. Local veterinarian puzzled by ageless feline Dr. James Wilson of Willow Glen Animal Hospital reports an unusual case that has left him professionally perplexed. Their distinctive orange tabby, brought in by the Rennick family after being found near their home, appears to be identical to a cat Dr. Wilson treated as a young veterinary assistant some 30 years ago. The markings are identical, not merely similar, but exactly the same pattern, Wilson told this reporter. I remember this cat clearly because of its unusual eye color and the distinctive M-shaped marking on its forehead. What's more, the medical anomalies are the same. A small notch in the left ear and a curious heart murmur that produces a sound almost like purring even when the cat is at rest. Dr. Wilson acknowledges that such identical characteristics in two unrelated cats separated by decades is highly improbable. If I didn't know better, I'd say it was the same animal. But that would make it at least 35 years old, which is, of course, impossible. The cat, now named Pippin by 5-year-old Elizabeth Rennick, appears to be in excellent health despite its supposed advanced age. Dr. Wilson plans to document the case for a veterinary journal. Merrick sat back in his chair, his heart racing. The Rennick family, Thomas, Imelda, and Elizabeth. The cat named Pippin. The timing, just before the violent incident that had shattered their family. It couldn't be coincidence. And if Dr. Wilson's observations were accurate, the cat that had come to the Rennicks in 1960 was itself a reappearance of an even earlier feline, one that had been around in the 1930s. How far back did this chain of appearances go? Continuing his search, Merrick found more instances scattered throughout Willow Glen's history. An orange cat that had led a lost child home during a blizzard in 1937, another that had appeared at the bedside of the town's founding matriarch in her final hours in 1912, yet another that had been credited with detecting a gas leak in the elementary school in 1975, preventing what could have been a terrible tragedy. Each incident involved a distinctive orange tabby that appeared without explanation, performed some seemingly purposeful act, and then vanished just as mysteriously. The descriptions were consistent enough to suggest it was the same cat, or at least cats so similar as to be indistinguishable from one another. And now, decades later, an orange cat with those same distinctive features had appeared in Merrick's life, leading him to discover the hidden threads connecting him to Eleanor's family history, to Imelda, to Elizabeth, to Pippin himself. "What are you?" Merrick whispered again, looking down at Pindle, who sat watching him with those knowing amber eyes. "A guardian, a guide, something else entirely?" As if in answer, Pindle stood and moved toward the archive cabinets that held physical documents, pawing gently at the drawer labeled 1900-1910. With a sense of following a path laid out for him, Merrick opened the drawer and began carefully examining its contents. Near the back, in a folder marked Town Founders, Personal Papers, he found what seemed to be a journal entry, handwritten on yellowing paper that had been carefully preserved in a protective sleeve. The entry, dated April 17, 1902, was from the personal diary of Catherine Willow, the town's namesake and one of its original settlers. "The strangest occurrence today. As I sat on the porch, contemplating whether to accept Mr. Glen's offer of partnership in the new township venture, a cat appeared, orange as autumn leaves with eyes like amber. It sat beside me for the longest time, neither demanding attention nor shying from it, simply present as I weighed this momentous decision. When I finally reached the conclusion to accept, to take this risk despite my fears, the cat rose, brushed against my skirts once, and departed down the path toward the woods. I have never seen it before and suspect I shall not see it again. Mother always said that cats see what humans cannot, that they walk between worlds. Perhaps this visitor was a sign, a confirmation that my choice, though frightening in its implications, is the right one. Whatever the case, I feel a curious peace now, as if having been granted a blessing from some benevolent force beyond my understanding." Merrick carefully returned the journal to its protective sleeve, his mind reeling. Catherine Willow's description matched Pindle perfectly. Not just his appearance, but his demeanor, that quality of mindful presence that Merrick had noticed from their first encounter. If what these records suggested was true, then the cat now known as Pindle had been appearing in Willow Glen for well over a century, always at moments of significance. Decisions, dangers, deaths, providing comfort, guidance, or protection before moving on to wherever or whatever came next. And now he had come to Merrick, leading him through a labyrinth of discovery toward... What? What was the purpose of these revelations? What was Merrick meant to understand or do with this knowledge? As he sat contemplating these questions, Pindle rose and stretched, then moved toward the door with clear purpose, looking back as if to say, "We've found what we came for. It's time to go." Thanking Harriet for her assistance, Merrick gathered his notes and followed Pindle out into the late afternoon sunlight. The autumn day was waning, shadows lengthening across Main Street as they walked to the car. "Where to now?" Merrick asked aloud, looking down at his feline companion. "You seem to be the one leading this journey." Pindle looked up at him, then toward the east where the road led out of town toward the rolling hills beyond Willow Glen. "The cemetery," Merrick said suddenly, understanding. "That's where we need to go next." Pindle blinked slowly, and in that simple gesture Merrick felt a confirmation that transcended words. Whatever answers awaited them, the next step of their journey would be among the quiet stones that marked the final resting places of Willow Glen's departed souls, including, perhaps, those connected to the mystery that had brought Pindle into Merrick's life. The Willow Glen Cemetery occupied a gentle hillside on the eastern edge of town, its entrance marked by wrought iron gates flanked by ancient oak trees. Established in the 1890s, it had expanded over the decades to accommodate generations of the town's residents, its oldest sections distinguished by weathered Victorian monuments and family mausoleums, its newer areas featuring simpler, more modern stones. As Merrick drove through the gates, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the grounds, gilding the headstones with warm light. It was a peaceful place, well-maintained and serene, more a garden of remembrance than a field of mourning. Eleanor was buried here, in a pleasant spot beneath a maple tree that blazed with color each autumn. Merrick visited regularly, bringing fresh flowers, speaking to her of small daily matters as if she might still hear him. But today, as he parked near the cemetery's central pathway, he sensed that Pindle was leading him toward a different destination. The cat jumped from the car as soon as Merrick opened the door, pausing briefly to orient himself, before setting off along the gravel path with purposeful steps. Merrick followed, noting that they were heading toward the older section of the cemetery, where the town's founding families and early residents had been laid to rest. The late afternoon was quiet, the only sounds the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze and the distant call of birds preparing for evening. They passed beneath old trees whose roots had, in places, disrupted the path, creating undulations in the once smooth gravel. Pindle navigated these with fluid grace, while Merrick followed more carefully, mindful of his aging knees. After several minutes of walking, Pindle veered left onto a narrower path that wound between weathered tombstones, some so old that their inscriptions had been partially erased by decades of wind and rain. The cat moved with confidence, as if following a map visible only to him. Finally, in a secluded corner, partially shaded by a spreading chestnut tree, Pindle stopped before a modest granite headstone. The stone was well maintained but clearly aged, its edges softened by time, a light coating of lichen spreading across its upper surface. Merrick approached slowly, an inexplicable tightness in his chest. The inscription read, "Thomas Rennick, 1930-1962, beloved husband and father, the light shines in the darkness." Beside it, a matching stone, newer and without lichen, Imelda Grace, Rennick, 1933-2022, love bears all things, and a third stone completing the family grouping, Elizabeth Ann Rennick, 1955-2020, daughter, mother, teacher, she persevered. Merrick stood in silence, absorbing the significance of what he was seeing. 3 generations of Eleanor's family, laid to rest together despite the fractures and secrets that had separated them in life. Thomas, whose violence had shattered his family. Imelda, who had fled with her daughter to begin anew. Elizabeth, who had grown up carrying the trauma of that night, passing its echoes to her own daughter. Eleanor arranged this, Merrick murmured, understanding dawning. After Elizabeth died, she had her buried here alongside Imelda's plot, and Thomas's. It made sense now. Eleanor had been working toward reconciliation, toward healing the wounds that had festered across generations. By bringing her mother to rest beside her estranged father, by purchasing the plot beside them for Imelda, she had been trying to restore in death the family unity that had been destroyed in life. Pindle sat beside the graves, his amber eyes fixed on Merrick as if waiting for him to understand something important. "Why did you bring me here?" Merrick asked softly. "What am I supposed to see?" As if in answer, the cat moved to Thomas Rennick's headstone and placed one paw gently on the earth before it. Then he did the same at Elizabeth's grave, and finally at Imelda's, creating a triangle of connection between the three. The gesture struck Merrick as deliberate, almost ceremonial, and in that moment something shifted in his perception. These weren't just graves. They were people, lives, stories. Thomas hadn't always been the violent man who killed his daughter's cat. He'd been a young doctor once, full of promise, transformed by war into someone he himself might not have recognized. Elizabeth hadn't been only a troubled woman with bipolar disorder. She'd been a little girl who loved her cat, who'd created stories about his magical nature, who'd carried both love and trauma into her own motherhood. And Imelda had been more than the distant aunt Eleanor had described. She'd been a young nurse, a frightened mother, a woman strong enough to leave when leaving wasn't what women did. As these realizations washed over him, Merrick noticed something he'd overlooked before. At the base of each headstone was a small carved symbol, a four-leaf clover, identical to the one Lisa Hargrove had drawn on her note. "The four-leaf clover," Merrick said aloud. "Imelda's symbol for the four people she truly loved." He looked at Pindle. "Including you." The cat blinked slowly, then turned his attention to something beyond Merrick's shoulder. Following his gaze, Merrick saw a small stone bench positioned beneath the chestnut tree, offering a view of the Rennick family graves. As Merrick approached the bench, he noticed a small bronze plaque affixed to its back, dedicated to the memory of Pippin, faithful friend and guardian. Some souls return when needed most. The inscription was undated, but the bench itself appeared to be fairly recent, perhaps placed within the last few years. Eleanor's doing, Merrick suspected, though he had no memory of her mentioning it. He sat on the bench, suddenly weary from the emotional weight of all he'd discovered. Pindle jumped up beside him, settling close enough that Merrick could feel the warmth of his small body against his thigh. "You've been guiding them for generations, haven't you?" Merrick said softly, stroking the cat's fur, "appearing when they needed you most. And now you're here for me." As the words left his mouth, Merrick realized their truth. Pindle had come to him in his grief, leading him through discoveries that had connected him more deeply to Eleanor than he'd been even during her life. Through the cat, he had learned the family secrets she'd been preparing to share before death intervened. He had come to understand her in ways that might not have been possible otherwise. But there was something more, something he was still missing. Pindle wouldn't have led him on this journey of discovery, merely to satisfy curiosity about the past. There was purpose in these revelations, something he was meant to do with this knowledge. As twilight deepened around them, Merrick sat quietly, contemplating all he had learned. The pieces were there, but the complete picture remained elusive, like a constellation whose pattern is visible only when viewed from the proper angle. "What am I missing?" he asked aloud. "What haven't I understood yet?" Pindle offered no answer beyond his steady presence, but as Merrick looked out over the Rennick family graves, bathed now in the soft glow of evening, something began to take shape in his mind. Not an answer exactly, but a direction, a sense of what might come next. "It's about healing, isn't it?" he said slowly. "About breaking the cycle of secrets and separation. Eleanor started the process, but she couldn't finish it." He thought of Margaret Simmons, who had known Elizabeth as a traumatized child and had recognized Pindle as Pippin, of Lisa Hargrove, who had witnessed Imelda's final days and the cat's mysterious presence during them, of the hidden connections that linked people across time, often without their knowledge. "I need to complete what Eleanor began," Merrick said, the certainty growing within him. "To bring these stories into the light, to acknowledge what happened and honor what was lost." As if in confirmation, Pindle pressed more closely against him, a low purr rumbling in his chest. The sound was comforting, affirming, like a wordless yes that resonated in Merrick's bones. They sat together as darkness fell completely, the cemetery now illuminated only by the rising moon and the distant glow of lights from the town below. In that peaceful stillness, Merrick felt a presence that transcended the physical, not a ghost or spirit in any traditional sense, but a connection to something larger than himself, a thread in a tapestry woven across time. "Thank you," he whispered to Pindle to Eleanor, to all the souls whose stories had led him to this moment of clarity. "I understand now." Rising from the bench, Merrick took one last look at the Rennick family graves, now silver-edged in the moonlight. Tomorrow would bring new purpose, new actions. For tonight it was enough to have found this understanding, this direction forward. "Come on, old fellow," he said to Pindle. "Let's go home." The cat jumped down from the bench and led the way back along the winding path, his orange fur almost luminous in the gathering darkness, a beacon guiding Merrick toward whatever awaited them next. Sunday morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect autumn day that seemed designed to lift the spirits. Merrick woke early, his mind already active with plans and possibilities inspired by the revelations of the previous days. Pindle was not in his usual spot at the foot of the bed. Instead, Merrick found him sitting in the living room, focused intently on Eleanor's writing desk, a small, elegant piece that had belonged to her grandmother. The cat looked up as Merrick entered, then returned his gaze to the desk with such evident purpose that Merrick couldn't ignore the silent suggestion. "Something in there I need to see?" he asked, approaching the desk that had remained largely untouched since Eleanor's death. The desk's surface held only a few items, a decorative pen holder, a small clock, a framed photograph of Merrick and Eleanor on their 30th anniversary. But as Merrick opened the center drawer, he found something unexpected, a leather-bound book with Community Stories Project embossed on the cover. Opening it, he discovered Eleanor's handwriting filling the first few pages, dated just 2 months before her death. Proposal for Willow Glen Historical Society, Hidden Histories, The Stories We Don't Tell. A collection of oral histories focused on the untold or overlooked narratives of Willow Glen families, particularly those involving trauma, mental illness, displacement, and reconciliation. The project aims to break cycles of silence and secrecy by providing a space for healing through shared storytelling. Proposed contributors: Margaret Simmons, childhood memories of teaching in the 1960s, residents of Emmanuel Care Home, end-of-life reflections, family members of Willow Glen's war veterans, impact of PTSD before it had a name, my own family history, pending. The remaining pages were blank, the project never realized, cut short by Eleanor's unexpected death. But the intention was clear. She had been planning to break the silence around her own family's history, to place it within the context of other untold stories in the community. "This is it," Merrick said softly, understanding blooming. "This is what I'm supposed to finish." Pindle blinked slowly, his amber eyes reflecting the morning sunlight. Over breakfast, Merrick began to formulate his plan. He would contact the Historical Society, propose continuing Eleanor's project. He would speak with Margaret Simmons, with Lisa Hargrove, with anyone else who might have pieces of the story. He would create a space for these hidden histories to emerge into the light, not just Eleanor's family story, but others that had remained in shadow. And Pindle would be part of it, the mysterious cat who had appeared throughout Willow Glen's history at moments of significance, providing comfort, guidance, protection. A being that defied easy categorization, but whose presence had touched so many lives across generations. By mid-morning, energized by this sense of purpose, Merrick decided to drive to the community center. The farmers' market would be in full swing, and he wanted to speak with Doris Chen about Margaret Simmons, to ensure she was recovering well and to ask permission to include her in the project. "Coming along?" he asked Pindle, who was watching him gather his keys and wallet. The cat moved to the door with evident enthusiasm, and soon they were driving through Willow Glen's sunlit streets, windows down to admit the crisp autumn air. Merrick felt lighter than he had in years, the grief that had been his constant companion since Eleanor's death, not gone but transformed, integrated into a larger understanding that included purpose and possibility. The community center parking lot was crowded, the weekly market drawing residents from throughout town. Merrick found a spot at the far end, beneath a maple tree whose leaves had turned a brilliant crimson. "I'll only be a few minutes," he told Pindle, who settled comfortably in the passenger seat, eyes already tracking the movement of shoppers and vendors across the lot. Merrick made his way through the market, stopping occasionally to greet neighbors or admire particularly fine produce. He found Doris at her usual post near the center's main entrance, clipboard in hand as she coordinated the day's activities. "Merrick," she greeted him warmly, "twice in 1 week. We're honored." "I wanted to check on Margaret," he explained. and to ask about something Eleanor was working on before she died, a community history project. "Margaret's doing remarkably well," Doris assured him. "The doctors found nothing seriously wrong, just a brief drop in blood pressure. She's been talking about your cat, though, telling anyone who'll listen about Pippin returning after all these years." "That's actually related to what I wanted to discuss," Merrick began, but he was interrupted by a commotion from the parking lot. Raised voices, a car horn, the sound of running feet. Turning, he saw a small crowd gathering near where he'd parked. A spike of anxiety shot through him as he realized his car was at the center of the disturbance. "Excuse me," he said hastily to Doris, already moving toward the parking lot, his pace quickening as the crowd grew larger. As he approached, he could see his car, still parked where he'd left it, but Pindle was no longer inside. Instead, the cat was in the middle of the crowd, sitting calmly beside a woman who had collapsed on the pavement. An elderly man, George Harmon, Merrick recognized, was kneeling beside her, his face tight with worry. "Marion," George was saying, his voice trembling. "Marion, can you hear me?" Marion Harmon, George's wife, who had been battling cancer. Merrick had seen her just a few weeks earlier at the pharmacy, frail but determined as she collected her medications. "Someone's called an ambulance," a bystander was saying. "They'll be here soon." "What happened?" Merrick asked, reaching the edge of the circle. "She just collapsed," someone explained. "Was walking to their car and went down." "The cat, your cat. He shot out of your car window and went right to her. Wouldn't let anyone move her." Indeed, Pindle sat beside Marion's still form with evident purpose, occasionally nudging her hand gently with his nose. Marion's eyes were closed, her breathing shallow but steady. George held her other hand, his weathered face etched with fear. "She's been getting weaker," George said, looking up at Merrick with tears in his eyes. "The doctors said it might be soon, but I thought we had more time." As if sensing the conversation, Marion's eyes fluttered open. She looked confused for a moment, then focused on the cat beside her. "Oh," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's you." Pindle moved closer, pressing against her side. A faint smile touched Marion's pale lips. "I dreamed about an orange cat last night," she said, her words slurring slightly. "Told George this morning. Said it meant something good was coming." George made a choked sound, somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "You and your signs and omens, Marion, always seeing meaning in everything." "Because there is meaning," she murmured, her gaze still on Pindle. "Some things come back when needed most." The phrase sent a chill through Merrick, the same words that had been engraved on the memorial bench at the cemetery. The same concept Imelda had written about in her letter to Eleanor. The wail of sirens announced the ambulance's arrival. As paramedics made their way through the crowd, Pindle reluctantly moved away from Marion, returning to Merrick's side. "That's a special cat you've got there," George said, as the paramedics began attending to his wife. "Knew something was wrong before any of us did." "Yes," Merrick agreed simply. "He is special." As Marion was carefully loaded into the ambulance, George paused before joining her. "Would you bring him to visit?" he asked Merrick, nodding toward Pindle. "At the hospital, I mean, or wherever she ends up. I think it would comfort her." "Of course," Merrick promised. "Whenever you need us." The crowd began to disperse as the ambulance pulled away, people returning to their shopping or moving toward their cars. But Merrick remained where he was, looking down at Pindle with a deepened sense of wonder and responsibility. "It's not just about the past, is it?" he said softly. "Not just about healing old wounds. It's about the present, too, about being there when needed." Pindle looked up at him, those amber eyes reflecting the morning sunlight, and in that moment, Merrick felt he understood, not everything perhaps, but enough. This remarkable cat, whether guardian spirit or simply an extraordinarily perceptive animal, had come into his life for multiple purposes. To connect him more deeply with Eleanor's history, yes, but also to lead him back into engagement with the living, with his community, with the ongoing story of Willow Glen and its people. The realization was both humbling and exhilarating. For 3 years, Merrick had been merely existing, going through the motions of life without truly participating in it. Now, through Pindle's mysterious guidance, he was being called back into the fullness of living, into purpose, connection, meaning. As they walked back toward the community center, Merrick's mind was already forming new plans. He would still pursue Eleanor's community history project, but with an expanded vision. Not just collecting stories of the past, but creating space for current stories to be shared, for connections to be made, for healing to happen in real time. Doris was waiting by the entrance, her expression concerned. "Is everything all right? I saw the ambulance." "Marion Harmon collapsed," Merrick explained, "but she was conscious when they took her. George is with her." Doris nodded, her face softening with compassion. "She's been so brave through all this. I'll organize some meals for George, make sure someone checks on him." "I'd like to help with that," Merrick found himself saying. "And with something else, too. Eleanor was working on a community history project before she died, focusing on untold stories, on breaking cycles of silence. I'd like to continue it, maybe expand it. Use the senior center as one of the gathering places." Doris's eyes widened with interest. "That sounds wonderful, Merrick. Eleanor mentioned it to me once, just the basic idea. I thought it died with her." "So did I," Merrick admitted, "but it seems it was just waiting for the right time to be revived." As they discussed possibilities, space at the center, potential participants, timeline, Merrick felt a growing sense of rightness, of pieces falling into place. This was what Pindle had been leading him toward all along. Not just the discovery of Eleanor's secrets, but the continuation of her work, the extension of her vision into the future. Later that afternoon, as they drove home through the golden light of autumn, Merrick glanced at Pindle, who sat in his usual spot on the passenger seat, watching the familiar streets pass by. "Thank you," Merrick said simply, "for everything you've shown me, for leading me back to life." The cat blinked slowly, then stretched out a paw to touch Merrick's arm briefly, a gesture so deliberate, so human-like in its apparent intention, that Merrick felt tears spring to his eyes. Whether Pindle was truly the same cat who had appeared throughout Willow Glen's history, the same Pippin who had died protecting Elizabeth, who had comforted Imelda in her final days, who had been recognized by Margaret Simmons after decades, Merrick couldn't say with certainty. Some mysteries perhaps weren't meant to be fully solved, only appreciated for the wonder they brought into ordinary lives. What he knew for sure was that this remarkable being had come into his life when he needed guidance most, leading him through darkness toward light, through isolation toward connection, through grief toward purpose. And in doing so, had transformed not just Merrick's understanding of the past, but his vision for the future. As they turned onto Cedar Lane, approaching the house that had once felt like a mausoleum of memories, but now seemed a place of possibility, Merrick made a silent promise. To Eleanor, to himself, to whatever forces had brought Pindle into his life. He would continue this journey of discovery and connection. He would help others share their stories, breaking cycles of silence that had perpetuated pain across generations. He would be present, attentive, open to the mysteries and meanings that life continued to offer, even in its later chapters, and he would do it all with Pindle by his side, for however long their paths remained joined. That evening, as twilight gathered once more, Merrick sat on the porch watching as the first stars appeared in the deepening blue sky. Pindle lay beside him, a warm, solid presence against his leg. From somewhere in the distance came the call of a mourning dove, no longer sounding like an unanswered question, but rather like a gentle affirmation, a reminder that beauty persisted, even as day gave way to night. "Life goes on," Merrick murmured, stroking Pindle's soft fur. "In ways we can't always understand but can learn to accept. Perhaps that's wisdom, not having all the answers but being at peace with the questions." Pindle's answering purr seemed to say that this too was enough, this moment of quiet companionship, this recognition of mystery within the ordinary, this acceptance of both endings and beginnings as part of the same continuous circle. As darkness settled fully over Willow Glen, lights appeared in windows across town, each one representing lives being lived, stories unfolding, connections maintained or newly formed. And in that tapestry of light and shadow, Merrick recognized his place, not isolated in grief, but woven into the larger story of his community, past and present, guided by an extraordinary companion who had appeared, as the memorial bench had stated, when needed most. Whatever tomorrow might bring, whether joy or sorrow, revelation or routine, he would meet it with new eyes, an open heart, and the quiet certainty that even the most ordinary life could contain unexpected magic if one only had the courage to see it. The end.